one of the brothers that are with me. I don't feel sick. I just have this laryngitis. It's just lingering, and I'm trying to work through it. So I'll try my best to keep my voice crackling too much, as I'm sure you know. But for that reason, I'm going to let Amy come up, and she's going to share scripture reading before we get started this morning.
This is Luke 23, verses 33 through 43. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots to divide his clothing, and the people stood by watching. But the leaders scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others, let him save himself if he is the Messiah of God, his chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine, and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was also an inscription over him, "This is the king of the Jews." One of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation. And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come in your kingdom." He replied, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise."
Amen. That is the gospel message for this week. This is Christ the King Sunday, as Dusty was alluding to earlier today. This Sunday is a Sunday, it's a celebration of the actual end of the year in our lectionary calendar. I know you guys know that it's actually New Year starts next week. It's not actually in December, but this is the end of the year, and at the end of the lectionary year is Christ the King Sunday, or Christ Reid Sunday, as traditionally remembered by the church. And it's kind of interesting, the passage we're reading today in that context, because the passage doesn't allude to that reigning of Christ like you would think. It's kind of interesting that they chose the passage of Jesus being on the cross, but I think that's absolutely unique to what the kingdom is, and we'll talk about that a little bit today. But to sum up the entire year, all the celebrations, all the Advents, all the things that we do from Advent to Lent to ordinary time to Easter, all culminates with this one very thing, that Christ is the rule and reign. God rules and God reigns above everything else. It comes to the point where we understand there is a kingdom and God is over all, and Jesus is the king of that kingdom. And for Christians, it's a reminder for us today. This day is a remembrance, a reminder of the idea that there is no ruling authorities that we worship. That's important to distinguish. There's religious, economic, political, and otherwise that are involved in our lives. There are religious, economic, and political, and otherwise that direct our lives at times, unfortunately. But the key difference is we don't worship those things. And this Sunday is a celebration of what we do worship and remind us of what we don't. There's a great quote by Mary Berger. I just found, she's a writer, an author. She's talking about Christ the King Sunday. It says, "On this day, we are also a triumphant people. This triumph is not human over human or even religious system over religious system. Instead, it is the victory of truth over the dehumanizing illusions spun by powers and principalities of this world. In our Christian freedom, we tear off the masks of death dealers and expose the strategies to the light." I just love the way she puts that. I love the way she illustrates and speaks to how this Sunday is to be remembered, and how this Sunday is to be recognized as it is the end of the year. And so our passage today talks about that, showing the light, shedding the light in the darkness. There's a lot of dark things you can take out of this passage. You can see clearly that this is the end of Jesus' earthly life. This is the end of the road for his human existence as he is getting ready to go through the cross and the crucifixion. All the principalities and powers have had their way with this. They have put him through trial. They have put him through the test, the Roman rule, the Jewish rule, and the Pharisees, and even the revolutionaries had their way with him because he was not chosen to be released by Barabbas, the revolutionary. So you have all these entities, these powers that are in play, making their moves, while Jesus humbly watches it happen and does not once raise his voice to say that or stop it. Even though he has the power to do that, he does not once move in that direction. He simply receives all that they have and then goes to the cross. And so this picture we have of Christ the King Sunday is Jesus on the cross as he is sitting between the two criminals that were crucified with him. So all the trials have done, everything's happened, and now he's sitting on the cross. And he looks around and sees the people standing there. And the paradox of this passage is Jesus is on the cross this Sunday. But the reality is that this is what true power looks like. In the reality of what we're talking about today, this is what true power looks like. How is it different? It's not like the Roman rule. It's not like the Jewish rule. It's not like the revolutionary rules. It is not like even the religious rule. There were several of those rules in place that were running the show. But Christ stands different from all those. So you start with the Roman rule, and even during the Jewish rule. Roman rule was like an upgrade of Babylonian. Romans figured out that the best way to rule a country, to continue to be in power, to stay in power, is to include others and let them feel like they had power. So you have in the days of Jesus, and we go into Advent, you'll read these stories about how there's Herod, the king, who is troubled about Jesus that's come to the world, and he's the king of the Jews, yet he still lives and exists within a Roman Empire that is ruling and reigning over everything. So the Romans figured out a way to continue to extend their power by letting others have limited power and continue to develop other nations by allowing other governors that were in place to continue to be in place, as long as they understood they don't cross the rule. They don't cross who is in charge of the kingdom. And that is truly the Romans. They are the empire leaders, and they desire power over everything else. But they were so desiring of power that they decided the best thing to do is help others, help continue that power by allowing others in, allowing to teach their ways. And then you have the Jewish rule. The Jewish knew they were limited in their power. King Herod and others knew they were limited in power, knew that they had limited capabilities, but they still were gifted and blessed by the Roman Empire because they helped keep key positions as governors, as rulers of certain areas. And all their desire was, okay, I'm not going to go against the grain. I'm not going to fight against the Roman Empire, but I am going to allow them to lead me, and I will be one that governs over a certain area, and I'll have my limited power that they give me. So these rulers in both states would continue to have this rule as long as they follow the rules. And Romans would build all their false narratives about how rulership would work around these things. They would build how they would treat people around this. So as long as you didn't cross the Romans first, and as long as you didn't cross the Jewish leaders second, then you were good to go. They didn't necessarily really fight over the Pharisees and their religious beliefs. That's why Pilate had such a hard time moving against Jesus, because he didn't really care that much about religious beliefs, but they just cared about keeping the status quo, keeping the things as they were. And they weave these ideas subtly into the culture of the people. They would treat them a certain way, and they would allow certain things to happen as long as they kept power, and they would constantly infuse Roman rule into the narratives and build these false narratives of what things should look like and how they should be. They would rewrite stories about how rule should be. And it's these false narratives of what they would talk about is what is good, what is righteous, what is virtuous, compared to what you thought was good, right, and virtuous. And that's how they kind of brainwash people in a sense of what it is, what's happening. So these false narratives play out throughout history. We have one coming up now that can be easily treated as a false narrative. I remember it wasn't until I was in my 20s and 30s that I realized what the true story of Thanksgiving was, and how I had this false narrative that was given to me all through my growing up years, even in school, and how they taught us about how the Native Americans and how the first settlers got together and shared love and had food together, and they lived in harmony and peace and joy. And that was the narrative we were taught about what Thanksgiving is. But it wasn't until, ironically, I started listening to some newer thinking and ideas about it that I ran across a song. It was actually part of a message that was given at the time about how the Native Americans were treated. It was by that great theologian Dave Matthews. He taught a song to me that really changed my thinking about it. And it's if you ever want to hear it, it's called "Don't Drink the Water." And it will really open up your eyes about true relationship between the settlers and Native Americans and what really had happened in that time. It's really eye-opening. But we're taught all our lives false narratives given to us by political powers, by others, about how things should look versus how things are. And this is exactly what was happening in this time. This is exactly how people were acting and responding to Jesus and to the Roman rulers. And so it continues on. So you have the religious authorities as well that would co-opt power as well and continue to hold their positions and places of authority over the people. They were the Pharisees, and they wanted to continue to teach the way they wanted to be taught. And we could go through all the stories about how religious power has failed us even in our lives and talk about all the things that went wrong with that, but we don't have time for that today. But you guys understand completely how religious power can be co-opted poorly. And then finally, you have that group that's the revolutionaries. These were the ones that wanted power. They were the Barabbases of the world that would do anything to unseat the power that was in place. They would thwart any kind of power that was there. They would try to fight against all the different authorities that were in place and make themselves the ruler. It wasn't because they wanted to give away the power to the people and become living in harmony. Their motives were still impure because they were going after the power that was in place to become a power. So all these different entities would do this. The revolutionaries sought to do this. And unfortunately, their way to do this was to, just like the empires would be, they would go after and respond with violence. They would go and speak violence and go and act out violence towards all the entities that were over them, that were ruling over them in that time period. So they sought to unseat the power too. And interestingly enough, as we read this story in Luke, we have two people that are also in the same position as Jesus being crucified. And oftentimes, it's interesting, we always have assigned the idea that they were thieves to this passage. I remember you can see several translations where it says thieves at times, but this particular reading says criminals. And one of the things that is an idea out there, again, it's not like they didn't know exactly the truth, but it's interesting thought, is that while Barabbas was let go, these two other criminals were also part of the same organization of revolutionaries that were going after the powers, and they were still set to be crucified with Jesus, but Barabbas was set free. And so that brings this interesting concept of now revolutionaries are being have violence enacted against them because they, again, just like Jesus, have now come to the same position. They are trying to take power from people that are in charge. And these revolutionaries are on the cross with them. We have this conversation between Jesus. There's Jesus on the cross with these two thieves. There's the mocking crowd. Let's back up. There's already been a ruling over Jesus by Pilate that he was being condemned to death. So there was that. There was the Pharisees that called for his crucifixion, even though he was innocent. And then now he's in front of the crowd being mocked and made fun of while he's on the cross, and they're casting lots for his stuff. And then there's these two other criminals that are on the cross with him. And they are now having a conversation with Jesus. They're having a conversation about what's happening. And while one continues to mock and continues to follow the example of all the narratives that have been taught about Jesus and about his way, the other recognizes that he was an innocent man. And of course, he was blessed for that on the cross. It doesn't say necessarily, by the way, that the other criminal was condemned, because you didn't hear that come out of Jesus' mouth. You just hear one thing, that there will be a blessing for that one, and it came and recognized him as the true leader in power. But Jesus, so interesting when you're on the cross, is doling out forgiveness while he is being condemned to death, while he is slowly dying, and on the cross, he is still doling out forgiveness, bringing healing and restoration to people, even though they don't necessarily want it. This is, again, the true nature of power is being exemplified here. This is the true nature of what a power should be. He does not overthrow the power and take on the throne. He doesn't co-opt the power and figure out a way to become a ruling authority underneath the Roman. He does not try to find ways to work well with the religious environment that's around him, that's very purist and eliminating those that are impure in all the ways. He responds to all that criticism, responds to all the things that are going on. Simply forgiveness, giving out forgiveness, as he says, you will join me where I'm going. And so this constitutes what is the true kingdom power. This is the cruciform life, as they call it. If you look at any scholars or anyone that's written about the theology of the cross, they talk about the cruciform life, a life that is self-giving, self-sacrificing, a life that is going the extra mile to do whatever it is to find healing and restoration, to bring others to the understanding that there is a love greater than their sins. And this life is what is the true example of what the kingdom is. This is what the true example of how the kingdom works and operates. I'm going to wrap it up here. So I wanted you to good time to let the kids know. But this cruciform life is what we are called to as Christians. We're called to do these things. We're called not to worship the empire, not to say that the empire is our Lord. And make it clear. I think this goes without saying. I'm not saying we're here to overthrow the empire. We obviously live and work and exist in an empire as well in our world today. And while we see and recognize that these powers are in place somewhat for our good, but also for the evil, depending on which people group you belong to, which is the problem with empires. They determine which people groups are more important than others. But we do not worship them. We worship the one true God. Today is a good day to reset our focus on what truly sustains us, that God and his kingdom life. And his kingdom life he's calling us to is a cruciform life, is a life of healing and restoration, a life of bringing hope to those around us, a life that looks at our fellow men and recognizes, yes, there are differences. We have major differences in so many ways. If anything over the last 3 years has taught us, with geopolitical and pandemic and everything else, we can find ways to fight over the simplest things in this world. We can find ways to battle at any time because we always feel like either we're getting our power taken from us or we're trying to seek out that power. But what Christ is calling us to is to bring healing in those situations, to bring hope and restoration in those situations, to bring the cruciform life, to bear on the world, to be a church that is a light in the darkness, in the sense that we can't see anything else around us except the light that comes from God. And so, as we end this year, as that's we come on up, prepare for worship. As we end this year in a celebration of what is the kingdom, we catch a glimpse of what's to come. And Dusty was speaking of this today. Next week begins Advent. This week we're celebrating, you didn't know it, but you are. We're celebrating, we're getting ready, we're preparing for the kingdom to come. We're celebrating what is now and what is a foretaste of what's yet to come in God. And then next week we go into Advent, which is darkness, which is surrounded by the mystery of what's about to happen as Jesus now comes into this world. That Jesus now enters into a place of a world that doesn't know him, but he is becoming part of it. And every week we will light a candle. We'll celebrate by lighting a candle. We'll begin by one candle in its hope, and we'll add another one, and a second, the third one, and the fourth one, and the light begins to flicker. It begins to grow in small, strange ways that don't make sense. That the Savior becomes incarnate in this world. And that's what Advent tells us. We go from the heights of the kingship down to the humble humility and humbleness of a manger and a baby that has nothing and owns nothing, but comes to change everything, to change the world around us. So light flames, maybe around your home, you'll have an Advent wreath of the candles, and you'll spend every week lighting a candle, hopefully thinking about the small beginnings, the flickers of hope that are around us. That sometimes things don't feel hopeful, but powers and principalities continue to prevail despite all that we try to do to show them the way. The principalities and powers continue to seek out power, seek out the things that they want. So let us understand that today and enter into humility as we prepare for the Christmas season and Advent of Christmas season, and prepare for Christ to come into the world. So as we stand today, as the kids, as we stand today, as we get ready to go to the table, the final table for this year, again, because it's a new year next week, don't forget. Today we celebrate who God is in Christ. We celebrate a kingdom that we are part of. We celebrate the ideas of Christ coming and being a part of us. We celebrate the cruciform life that teaches us how to be humble, how to find ways to love one another. So as the community servers can come up and be prepared. We ask today that you take the cup and take the bread and the cup and feast on the celebration and remember all the things that are hopeful about the world around us. At times it doesn't feel hopeful.